So one of the things we see that's happened in the history of humanity in 6,000 years of recorded history is that there's never been an international world institution that's been elected democratically by all the people of the world to represent the interests of the human beings who are the occupants of planet Earth and the citizens of the world. And they've never had this type of an institution that was set up until Bahaullah first announced this plan for a durable peace, where the nations can form a council and discuss their differences and settle their disputes and problems at the council table with fairness and justice, and not have to result to war for the settlement of disputes between the nations. Now, because everything's so interdependent with all the different countries and people economically and globally, with the internet and communications and travel and all of these things that have shrunk the world into a global village, war itself is obsolete. It causes more damage and more harm, not just to people, which is the main problem, but even to people's business interests and money making now. So war has become non-feasible and they have to get rid of it. But when they imitated Baha'u'llah's peace plan with the World Court and the League of Nations and the United Nations, in these three main instances, we haven't seen an international institution since after the coming of Baha'u'llah, not before that. And these imitations in the World Court and the League and the UN never outlawed war. They maintain what's called the law of war, meaning that when you have war, you're supposed to follow certain rules. And if you violate the rules of war or the law of war, you could be held accountable for war crimes, crimes committed that break the rules of war during a war itself. But no international institution has ever declared war to be illegal. And this is what Baha'u'llah's message is to the people of the world when he offered them the great peace of their time. He stated that they didn't have to accept the new revelation that he was giving on the spiritual dimensions of Tawheed, but that they should accept the guidance that God has given through him, being the Prince of Peace, seated upon the throne of David, the prophesied Davidic king that would bring peace to the earth, that Christ was the herald of. The word Christ coming from the Greek word Christos, which is the same as the Hebrew word Messiah, which means anointed one. But anointed one of what? The full title in Hebrew is the anointed male sperm descendant of King David, or the Messiah ben David. And so the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims know that there's a promised one who is to be descended from King David, that will inherit the throne of David, who will give a tremendous revelation that will bring peace to the world. And this is spoken of in Isaiah chapter 2 and chapter 9 and chapter 11. In chapter 9, it states that his name shall be called the Everlasting Father and the Prince of Peace. And upon the throne of David and over his government, to uphold it and to establish it for this time forth and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall perform this. So Baha'u'llah fulfills prophecy for the human being who is to be seated upon David's throne, because it says, for unto us a son is born and a child is given, or unto us a child is given and a son is born. So this promised one is to be a male child born of a woman, descended from King David, that would give this revelation for how we can have peace on earth through justice being established. And there's never been an international institution elected by the people that have said war is illegal, that it is illegal, period, to have war. And the reason for this conflict of interest is what Putin did when he invaded the Ukraine, or what the United States did when it invaded Iraq, or what Russia and the United States did when they alternately invaded and abandoned Afghanistan, is not illegal. Because according to international law, in the Treaty of Westphalia, nation states, in quotes, have the right to make war. It's a right of the nations to be able to make war upon each other. So it's not illegal. As a matter of fact, it is legal. It's legal for the nations to make war and invade one another, and that this is not made illegal. But they restricted like the reasons why you can make war, and they restricted when you have a war, the type of inhumane behavior that the people can have and the soldiers during the war. And supposedly during a war, there's, for instance, the rules of war is one country is only allowed to strike the other country's military targets. If they're supposed to be forbidden in the rules of war, in the law of war, from harming civilians. And if you read the United Nations Charter, it upholds the rules of war. The United Nations never outlawed war at all. Neither did the League of Nations, and neither did the World Court. So we just have human rights councils that you can complain if there's been a war that innocent people were killed in violation of these rules of war. So this is why the world is suffering. And these institutions that were imitations of Baha'u'llah's peace plan never went all the way and followed through with starting by saying this, that it's a basic human right of a human being is the right to life. Every human being has the right to live their life that God gave them on the planet, wherever they might be living. And therefore, the war from the nation states has to be illegal, because it's the war of the nation states is a fundamental violation of the basic human right. That's the right to life. Now, in the United States' legal documents that found the country of the United States, all the citizens in the United States are endowed by their creator with an unalienable right. And the first right they mention there, although there's among others, is the right to life. So this means that American citizens have the right to life above and beyond Iranian citizens, Israeli citizens, British citizens, Russian citizens, other citizens. So if just one group of people has the right to life, then this implies that other people outside of that nation state don't have the right to life. So, for example, I'm not familiar with the legal documents of Britain or France or Russia. We'll just stick with these Christian countries, or the country that you're from, or some of the other ones. But the United States of America is the only one that guarantees the right to life to the citizens. Now, when the United Nations Charter was set up, they were kind of fumbling around with this, because if they guarantee this, the citizens of all the member nations of the United Nations, according to the United Nations Charter, the right to life, then this would trump, just to use that word, the right, so-called, of the nation states to make war. So in doing this, they never made war illegal. War has to be made absolutely illegal. If war was made illegal, Russia would not have been able to go into the Ukraine, because they would have broken the law. And the nation states are law abiding. They don't break these laws. But they try to get around things during a war. So they'll store a bunch of ammunition in a children's hospital. Then the enemy will find out about this, and they'll bomb the children's hospital or the school or a civilian neighborhood. And they're using the civilians during these wars as kind of like human shields, thinking that the other sides will abide by the so-called rules of war. So these rules of war have to be abolished. The law of war has to be repealed. And war, every human being on the planet who's a person, doesn't matter if they're a man or a woman, or a Jew or Christian or Muslim, or some other religion, or what their skin color is, or how tall they are, or if they're fat or skinny or thin, or if they're old or young, they have the right to life. And this means that war, when a nation state would do this, is a basic violation or a fundamental violation of the basic human right to life. So as we go into this phase where we're leaving nationalism and moving into internationalism, where the affairs, the material affairs of our planet need to be coordinated globally, because we live in a shrinking world with communications. We have a global village. They're going to have to make this first step to outlaw war. For example, if we had a thermonuclear war right now, and Russia and the United States fired their nuclear weapons upon each other, they would fly over the North Pole. Because if you look at a globe, most people look, around the horizon or the equator, east to west. Russia and the United States look very far away from each other. But if you look at the top of the globe where the Arctic Circle is, you can see that Russia and the United States are very close to each other. They just fire the nuclear missiles over the top of the North Pole. And it takes about 30 minutes for the Russian missiles to arrive in the United States, and about 30 minutes for the US to retaliate. This is why the book of Revelation in the Bible and the prophecies in the Holy Quran say that this will happen in 1/3 of mankind would be killed in 1 hour of fire or thermonuclear war. And this is spoken of in the scriptures. So were the Russia and the United States to fire these nuclear weapons upon each other, it would be completely devastating. That every American city of a population of 100,000 or more would be taken out in a nuclear strike from the Russians. And the retaliation from the United States would be just as devastating upon the Russian cities and the Russian people. The difference between Russia and the United States in such a 1 hour of thermonuclear conflict is that the United States of America has no bomb shelters and no fallout shelters and no food storage and no radiation monitoring equipment in place for the people, the general population of the United States, to take refuge and be safe. Whereas in Russia, like in England and some other countries, they have a subway system deep below London and deep below the surface of Moscow and other places. So the Russian people would be able to go underground in their basement, and after the 1 hour of nuclear war or in the subway system, they'd be able to come back out when the fallout has degraded. Fallout has a half-life of about 4 to 6 hours. So at the ground zero event, you'll have heavy radioactive material like plutonium or uranium. And it's so heavy that when the bomb goes off, the nuclear material falls straight down to ground zero. Everything else in the mushroom cloud and in the dirt and the dust and the fire and in the smoke from the thermonuclear blast, whether it's a hydrogen bomb or an atomic bomb or some other type of nuclear bomb, it irradiates the other material that holds a radioactive charge, but only for a small period of time. And the reason it gets like that is because it was exposed to the original core radioactive material, like the plutonium or the uranium or whatever the material was they were using. And people are familiar with this phenomenon. If you've ever played with a magnet, a bar magnet, is made out of iron and it has a magnetic charge to it. You can take a metal nail, like a 16-penny metal nail, and it's not magnetic at all. You can rub the nail on the magnet and the nail will become magnetic. You can pick up other nails with that. This is called induced magnetism. And eventually the magnetism that was in the nail will fade away and it won't be magnetic anymore because it's not actually a bar magnet where all the atoms at the atomic level of iron are aligned in the same direction, producing the flow of magnetic force. It only temporarily becomes magnetic. So when the nuclear bomb goes off, the fallout only becomes temporarily radioactive. It's like induced radiation. And it has a half-life of 4 to 6 hours. And after about 2 weeks in a fallout shelter, the people can come back out and grow food and start to rebuild their homes and things like this. But the United States, the American people here in the United States of America, because of the nuclear international treaties like mutual assured destruction and these other policies they have, and the symmetry they have, like SALT 1 and SALT 2 and arms reduction, the United States agreed to no longer fund its fallout and bomb shelters for the citizens of the United States. So the American people don't realize this, but they're being held hostage as a human shield by the United States government itself, because the United States government put forward a goodwill effort to Russia and China and the other nuclear powered nations and other nations of the world, stating that the proof that they wouldn't start a nuclear war is that they're not going to prepare to save their citizens during a nuclear war. So therefore they would receive the most damage. So therefore they were saying this was an olive branch, that they weren't going to be an aggressor in trying to start such a nuclear war. Point of what I'm saying is this, that the 1 hour of nuclear war, which is not only prophesied of to happen in ancient scripture, is possible to happen now that we have these nuclear weapons and we have a bipolar world between the Eastern and Western Christian powers that possess these horribly destructive weapons of mass destruction. And the point is that if they fire off these weapons in the 1 hour of nuclear war, they're not breaking the law. It's legal. It's legal for them to fire the nuclear weapons at each other. It's not illegal. Unless war is actually made illegal. War is illegal. Unless the law of war is repealed, we're going to keep having wars. So if people don't like these wars, any of them, like the war, the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Yemen is another problem that's happening there. The Palestinians are in a civil war. And then we had like the war between Iran and Iraq that just killed millions of people over 8 years. I mean, we're tired of living through this. And there's a war in Mali, a war in Sudan, Syria's destroyed. It's just horrible. It results in genocidal type numbers. Well, they say it's not a genocide. It's not like they took the millions of Iranian soldiers and put them in a camp like Hitler did with people that he disagreed with during World War II, or the United States rounded up the Native Americans and put them into concentration camps, reservations, or the Japanese Americans were rounded up and put into camps during World War II in the United States, but they weren't death camps at least. But the Germans had death camps, and people say this is genocide. Well, 1 million people dying in a war, like in the Iran-Iraq war, 1 million people still a genocidal number. This is just terrible. And when they do these wars, they can't plant crops, and then the people will starve. We've had people in these wars where they've killed hundreds of thousands. We've seen like 3 million die in the aftermath of the war due to starvation and disease, and because of this famine that they have. So this has to end. War used to be beneficial and positive. If we were living somewhere and we had a different religious belief or a different culture or a different language than other people, and these people decided to invade our villages and towns in the region that we lived in, the villages and towns in that area had to have a collective security agreement. So the city states formed nation states so that they wouldn't be destroyed by marauders coming from another city state. But now the nation states have grown to such a degree of sophistication and administration and control and management that the average person in all of the countries has no say-so on the policies of these nation states, that, like in the United States, corporations are considered people now, legally, a person. They have more voting power, and the people who are elected to office don't represent the people in the United States and their needs to protect the old, the sick, the elderly, provide schooling from the young. The representatives in Washington, D.C. represent the corporations who are part of the war machine that in some way have financial interest to maintain the war going. And other people are profiteering individually off sanctions and these wars. So you'd think that every human being on earth who's a person would realize that they have a right to life. So this needs to be made legally. Before people are actually going to have the enjoyment of living on a planet that is free of war, free of sanctions, and free of hostilities and aggressions, the source problem has to at least be illegal. For instance, in the city that I live here in Colorado, and I'm sure in the towns everybody listening lives in your own towns, murder and assault are illegal. They're illegal. They're not legal. If it was legal to murder people like it used to be 200 years ago, well, then I could be down in the market in some town, and they would brush up against me. And if they pushed me and I didn't like them, I'd stab them with a sword and kill them. Everybody else on the market would be like, yeah, that untouchable touched him, so he killed him. And they would go on with their business. But if murder is illegal, then people don't do these things. And in this town, if somebody were to punch somebody in the nose or something like that, they call the police and they would get an assault charge on them, and everybody would know who the aggressor was, and everybody would know that it was illegal, and everybody would know that that person broke the law, that they knew it was illegal before they did it also. So this is the purpose of having these things set in law, is that it prevents the majority of people from crossing the line, and it prevents the majority of people from committing these acts because they have a core value that they don't want to violate. And the core value, of course, is that we're human beings. We have the oneness of humanity. And every person, regardless of race, creed, color, or gender, is a human being or age, and has the right, or sexual orientation, and has the right to life. And the right to life for the human being is a basic human right, and that doesn't give another person the right to take their life from them. So therefore, assault and murder are illegal because it violates the right to life on an individual basis. The right to life is so important that war between the nation states should also be illegal. If it's illegal for one person to get a gun and go into the subway or Tel Aviv or Los Angeles, we had 3 spree shootings worldwide this week that at least made the news, and shoot everybody in there, and this is considered murder, then why is it that when a war hero comes back from the war and has killed millions of people, like Bush II in the Iraq destruction of Baghdad, and shock and awe and mission accomplished, they had a giant ticker tape parade for this people as if they're heroes. Yet they've killed way more people than just somebody murdering somebody in a town. And what if they murdered the person in the town because they were starving and they were robbing the grocery store to get food? You know, these circumstances alter cases. So these nation states have needs which are supposed to be for the protection of the needs of the people who live in the fictitious borders they created for their management systems. This whole idea that Putin has put forward, he stated that Ukraine is not an actual country, that he's talking about how it's part of Russia. Well, according to Mearsheimer, the professor of power politics at Chicago University in the United States, he said he agrees with Putin that Ukraine's not a nation state. And then he says neither's Russia and neither's the United States. He says this is all made up. The earth is just one country and people live somewhere and they create a fake border in their mind and they call this the United States of America or Russia or Ukraine. That the truth is there's still just people living in these areas that want to be able to elect local and regional government to manage their resources. The other thing about the Ukraine that the West is concerned with is the Ukraine's the breadbasket of Europe. It's the breadbasket of the East. They use this term breadbasket in the United States because in the middle part of the United States, they grow a lot of wheat and things, and this is called the breadbasket of the world also. So when Hitler was trying to gobble up Europe to make all the different independent countries in Europe one empire, which he was calling the Third Rome or the Third Reich, he wanted to take the Ukraine for himself so he could use that for the breadbasket of his new empire. And the Russians were obliged to stop him and the Ukrainians with the German incursion into the area of Ukraine during World War II. And Bahaullah has made prophecies about this. Bahaullah, when he was banished from Baghdad, Iraq, from the Garden of Rizwan in 1863, was on a 110-day land journey in a howdah from Baghdad to Samsun, which is on the coast of the Black Sea, just south of the Ukraine. And the believers asked him to write a tablet or reveal a tablet about this. And he revealed 3 tablets that kind of go together. In the tablet of the Howdah, he says that this is a prophecy that will take place at the Black Sea in the future, and words to that effect. And he says it should be studied by the Bahais in conjunction with the tablet of the Holy Mariner. And he talks about how this conflagration that takes place at the vision of the Black Sea is related to his own covenant and to his own revelation, as stated in the tablet of the Holy Mariner. Well, in the book of Revelation, it talks about a final battle that a lot of people have philosophized about and tried to interpret, called the Battle of Armageddon. In fact, this is named after a city in the Holy Land called Megiddo, where there were many famous ancient battles. That in order to take the city of Jerusalem, foreign armies and foreign troops would come down through this valley between the mountain, and there's a valley in Jerusalem. They'd come in through Megiddo in this area. When Abdulbaha predicted the start of World War I in 1912, and then it broke out in 1914, he stated that this was the beginning of the Battle of Armageddon. And World War I actually ended with the British fighting a final battle at the historical location of Megiddo. But the causes that resulted in World War I were not resolved by the war itself. So World War II broke out for the same reasons that caused World War I. And now this war that we're seeing internationally in the same region, where the Straits of the Bosphorus and the Ukraine represent the borders between the East and the West, or Europe and Asia, is still boiling up. The purpose of having a war is to settle permanently a human dispute. So, for instance, in 1776, the United States of America, that were colonies for the British Empire, wanted independence. So they fought a war for independence, and they won. And now they're independent, and now they're not at war with Britain anymore at all. That was just what their revolutionary cry was, to gain independence. Once independence is gained, there's no reason to remain in our mindset, some sort of revolutionary spirit. The revolutionary spirit that caused the people in the United States of America and the colonies to break away from England was transmuted into the election process they have here in the United States. So in other words, in the United States of America, the American citizens, according to the thinking of the founders of the country here, have a bloodless revolution every 4 years by overthrowing the government and replacing it with a different people. And that's called an election. So instead of having a violent, bloody revolution and overthrowing the government and then setting up new government, and then that government becomes corrupt, and having another bloody revolution and then overthrowing that government and setting up a new government, which eventually becomes corrupt, and then overthrowing that government and having another bloody revolution, if you see what I mean, that instead we just have a regular election. So we don't like the people who are in the government, well, then we don't vote for them the next time. We have a revolution. We overthrow the government legally by an election, and we elect new people. The United States worked very well for quite a while doing this, until corporations and huge money interests were able to buy the people who are getting elected, and they're able to fund the campaigns for advertising who should be elected, and they're able to restrict who can debate in the presidential debates during election. And the United States society is almost at a complete new revolutionary pitch right now, because the people want to take back the government here away from these corporations that believe war should be legal, in that because they make money off of the war. And this is why we saw a large group of people storming Washington, D.C. on Three Kings Day, the day of the Magi, on January 6th, about a year ago, or over a year and a half ago. So the whole world is in a state of flux. Every country is disrupted. All the people everywhere upset. They marched around the planet when this George Floyd thing happened, saying, you know, I can't breathe. So everybody is feeling this, and nobody knows what to do, and nobody knows what the divine guidance is, and everybody's complaining about everything, and nothing is working right, economically or environmentally or personally or socially. It's just completely baffled, and this is the prophecy. We have the pandemic, the lockdown, the economic collapse, which includes the famine, and now this war. And this can result in World War III, and then worse calamities after that. A meteor striking the earth, a great earthquake, an earth-shifting crust. These are like different levels of 4 waves of destruction, or 4 winds of destruction or purification that are prophesied of in the Quran and in the book of Revelation. And these winds of destruction always follow the same pattern. They start out smaller, and if the problem isn't dealt with, they escalate until their force is completely destructive and purifying, and the problem is remedied through the annihilation of the problem itself. But it starts out smaller so we can identify it, and if we work together as human beings, we can make the correction and avoid the catastrophe by making the right choices during the crises. And crises means choice. It doesn't mean catastrophe or disaster. If we don't make the right choice during a crisis, which literally means the point of making a choice, it'll result in a personal or global or group calamity. So this happened during the days of the heroic age of the ministry of Baha'u'llah and Abdulbaha. One of Baha'u'llah's principles is the equality of men and women. And right around the time that Abdulbaha was coming to the United States of America in 1912, the human rights people, the spiritual people, were all fighting for different causes and social justice. They had women in the United States and men that were fighting in the suffragette movement so that women could get the equal right to vote. They were still dealing with the aftermath of banning slavery, with civil rights problems. They were seeing problems in the school system. They were dealing with prohibition, was an issue with the mass production of alcohol in this country that was destroying the spiritual fiber that kept the people together. Working cooperatively in the United States was an issue. And then there were other issues. So everybody got together and they were talking about what they could do. They were all divided into many different factions with many different causes, all causes to better humanity, all causes to better establish human rights and allow the true spirit of the individual to come out so we could have a pure spiritual democracy and not have our minds controlled by other people or the government or the state or a church, but so that we could all be independent of all save God and have the right to life, the right to liberty, free choice in our life, and the right to the pursuit of happiness, which was symbolized by a flag in the United States of a snake. And this flag said, "Don't tread on me," meaning the snake or the serpent is the symbol of our intellect. And in order to fulfill our right to life and our free will liberty, we should have the pursuit of happiness, which is our right to use our intellect to seek the truth, and the truth will set us free, on our own journey and our own path back to God. As the Bab said in his holy writings, there is many pathways back to God as there are individual souls that God created. But we're all from the one true invisible God. So, and we don't know anything about God in essence, so there's no reason to argue about religion at all. It's a great mystery, like the Native Americans say, the Wanka Tonka, the great mystery, or the great spirit. We want to have this for ourselves. So we have life, liberty, and the use of the intellect, and the pursuit of happiness here in America. But they haven't outlawed war. So all the people of the world are disgruntled. And at the time of Susan B. Anthony and the human rights workers during the days of Abdulbaha at the turn of the century, around 1900, they were divided into many different causes. So they had a big meeting. And Susan Anthony got up there and she spoke amongst them. And she said, what we need to do is, although we all have these different causes and goals to benefit human beings and to enhance their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we want this for all people, not just a white elite, but for all groups, and not just for men, but for women, and not just for grown-ups, but for adults. We want these type of things for everybody. We're not going to be able to do anything, because united we stand and divided we fall. And we're all divided the same way the world's divided now into Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Bahais, indigenous people. Everybody's doing their own thing and has their own spiritual path in their own religious community. Sunni, Shiite, Protestant, Catholic, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Renewal, all of the different groups have different sects even within them that they're divided up with, and they don't cooperate with each other. So united we stand, divided we fall. So the spiritual people of the world are divided. They're divided into these different religious churches and sects and groups. And if the religious people could cooperate, the whole thing would change immediately. But like she said, when Susan B. Anthony spoke before them, she said that they can't get together to cooperate. So she said, united we stand, divided we fall. And then she said, we need to just pick one thing that we all agree upon that we're fighting for. And if we could get that one thing changed, then all the other things would be changed right away afterwards. But we have to maybe set aside our personal pet project, for back burner it, and come together and all focused on one particular front of the fight here for human rights. And so they got into a big argument, like, what should it be? This, racism, education, health, what should it be? And so she says that she believed that the thing that would unify them would be the suffragette movement, the right for women to have votes equal with men. But then they all got in an argument. They're like, oh, of course you're saying that. You're Susan B. Anthony. That's your cause. And they said, and they were talked about it. And then she says, hear me out. She says, I have a reason for this. And so they quieted down. Like, what's the reason? She says, look, if we all band together and give women the right to vote, we will double the number of votes that we have in the United States. And majority of people who are in favor of all the other changes, there's more women who are actually in favor of this than the men who are involved in it. So she said, if we get women the right to vote, then we'll have a greater voting base of men and women, and then we can vote through civil rights and the educational reform and all of this. And they looked at each other, they're like, hey, she's right. If we get that vote together, we will also get all the things that we wish. And so they all got behind this one idea of giving women the right to vote, and it passed in the United States. And it's been not even a full 100 years, or it's been about 100 years since 1922, of course. And now we see there's a Black woman who's on the Supreme Court as a justice appointed for life. This is just one example for the United States of America. So it worked. So within 100 years, because they focused on one thing they could all agree on, they got all the rest of the things they were arguing about at least put in place legally, and then people fulfilling it actually within that century. So today we face the same problem. We want a green economy. We want the removal of sanctions. We want fair trade for all the people of the world. We want internet access for everybody. So if I want to buy a baklava from Tehran, I can go on the internet and they'll ship it all the way to the United States of America. If somebody there wants to buy a computer from Silicon Valley in California, it'll be shipped over there. If I want to get a Persian rug, I can do that. If somebody wants to get, something from America there, they could do that. And the trade of goods and services which we want to have, we also want all of our nation states or our cultures that are in those regions to be preserved. We want to preserve our literature, our language, our history, our culture, the things that make us unique, because we want to have unity in diversity. We'd like free thought, and we'd like the free exchange of ideas to happen all over the world. When Benjamin Franklin, who was a United States citizen, did his scientific experiments on electricity, he came up with the idea of a lightning rod, because many of the churches in England and other places were getting struck by lightning because they were the tallest buildings in the area and they'd burned to the ground. So he discovered this idea that lightning was attracted to metal, and if that was taller than the building, the lightning would strike the rod and go down into the ground and not burn the building down. He didn't patent this. He gave that technology as a free open source to all the people of the world. The same thing with his eyeglass spectacles that he made. He gave this back to humanity for free. He could have patented and trademarked his inventions and become a millionaire and greedily for personal aggrandizement and self-empowerment collected up a bunch of money for himself, but he didn't do that. He donated these things for the advancement of the human race, regardless of race, creed, or color. He gave it to all people, even though he himself said he was a little bit biased and bigoted when it came to people that were different than him. He still overcame that and was aware of it and still used his inventions and skills. He said he benefited from the technology other people provided, like the wheel and fire. Why shouldn't he give back his discovery for free to the rest of humanity? So today we're in the same kind of a situation where we'd like to see the end of pollution and getting off of fossil fuels and having a trade and cultural exchanges all throughout the world. But there's too many things happening all at once. There's the world health problem, the food problems, the sanctions problems, and the list goes on and on and on. So human beings today, the same as they were 100 years ago, need to come to the conclusion that we have to focus on something specific that's one cause that we can fight for. And if we fight for this one thing and we win, then all of the other things we want will fall into place next. Well, everything else that people are complaining about, the sanctions, the trade problems, the economic wars, and all of these racial issues, the gender issues, all of these issues that people are still complaining about are resolved if we focus on what is causing all this. And what's causing all this is we live inside a world in which the economy and our daily lives circumambulate around the Qibli of the war machine. As long as our point of adoration is the military-industrial complex and the nation states are competing with each other to flex their muscle and their machismo by building dams and ruining the environment and tall buildings to compete with each other, this is just absolute childish silliness. In the Bible, Paul says, when I was a child, I played with childish things, and now that I'm grown, I put these childish things away. That the glory of the nations today should be in how happy the citizens are that live in that country, what their subjective well-being is, what their spiritual development and happiness and advancement is, how they're able to express their freedom of thought and so forth, how there's no crime in the country, how all the citizens are happy in the country and supporting the government that's providing their needs for them, and how gracious and stylish this country is in its nobility in dealing with the other nations where the people live in those countries that are its friends and neighbors. Not building a tall building or a mega dam to block off all the water to go into India, or to cut the water off at the Golan Heights and starve people, or somewhere else. This is not cooperating together. So what's the thing we could focus on? It's simply this: make war illegal. If war is made illegal and it's stated that it's illegal, and there's an international institution that who's founded on the basic premise that war is illegal because it's a violation of basic human rights. And when I say war is illegal, I mean nation states will be repealed. The law of war is no longer allowed to be legal. This is when we will have the lesser peace or peace on earth. As long as war is not made illegal, nation states will keep making war. If war was already illegal, Putin wouldn't have went into the Ukraine. If war was already illegal, the United States would not have been able to go into Iraq. They would not have been able to topple this government. And the countries of the East are armed to the teeth. Russia has an economy that's less than the state of Texas. It doesn't have enough money to finance soldiers of the citizens of Russia to invade and conquer and govern and absorb, Ukraine and Poland and Lithuania and the Baltic states. We're just not looking at an empire expansion scheme taking place here. The only thing that's been expanding and swallowing up many, many countries is that the countries have been joining NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. And the way that's structured, it's not structured in a way that you can have 4 charter countries like England, France, the United States, and Russia being the charter members of NATO with fairness, where the new members who join get equal rights and equal votes and things like this. There's still a command structure in NATO that gives the West more leeway. Well, what is the West so up to by extending NATO all the way to the East and inviting countries like Georgia, which are just near Iran, and Ukraine into NATO? What is the purpose of this? Well, what's the fundamental difference between the federal system of the United States and the Russian Federation and the Federation in China, that they have a bunch of smaller states managed out of Beijing? Well, from what I can understand, is the Federation of the United States is the only federation that by law guarantees invoking God. Our Creator has endowed us with unalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So nobody living in the United States of America, where they're already guaranteed the right to life and they have the First Amendment freedom, wants to wind up in a society where those aren't clearly stated in the foundational documents. And the United Nations doesn't state that we're endowed by our Creator with anything. The reason is that during the time the United Nations Charter was put together, FDR and Stalin and Churchill were still alive, and Russia was communist. And so they couldn't mention the Creator in the documents of the UN. So there's another reason the UN is going to fail. The second reason is they didn't make war illegal at the UN. And the third problem is, if you read the UN Charter, it defines enemy states. You can't set up a United Nations or an international supreme tribunal that's meant to be for all the nations and peoples of the world. There are no enemy states. But in the UN Charter, they define enemy states as the people who are the enemies to them during World War II. So it's not a valid collective security agreement. The UN wasn't given teeth. And then NATO kind of became a strong arm, or the US president, a strong man for the UN, the IMF, and these systems. The IMF has just announced this week that because of the war and the pandemic, we're heading into the full total disintegration of international cooperation. Okay, well, why can't we cooperate? In order for us to solve all the other problems of the world, we have to cooperate. War is the opposite of cooperating. So if we're going to let cooperation live, we have to make war illegal. Some leader of some country, whether it's the leader of North Korea or Zelensky in Ukraine, has to come out and say war needs to be made illegal, and the other nations need to do this. Well, they might not do this, but every human being on the earth should realize this is the lowest common denominator. I am a human being, they should say. I am a person. I have the right to life. Therefore, nation states do not have the right to make war. This is the spiritual and global revolution of the individual human being. Baha'u'llah states this in the Gleanings, where he says that the greater world has been subdued, and now the human being is now the greater world, and the universe and the world outside is the lesser world. In other words, in ancient religious and spiritual systems and philosophical and scientific systems, they had the idea that the universe, you know, the stars, the sun, the moon, the galaxies, and the planet that orbit the sun and the world that we live in, that this universe was called the macrocosm, and that the person in their body was the microcosm, meaning that the entire universe is folded up within the person, and that because the universe is so big, it's greater world, or it's macro. And the size of a human being, maybe they're 5 foot or 6 foot tall as an adult, is small. So they're the microcosm. It's explicit in the Gleanings of the writings of Baha'u'llah that he's declared, no, now if the manifestation were to declare heaven to be earth and earth to be heaven, it should be true. And in the Gleanings, he declares that the human being, you and you and you and you and you know, us as an individual human being, just by yourself, one human being, he says the human being is the macrocosm, and the universe materially outside is the microcosm. And this is what people need to realize. If they realize their own self-worth, their own value, they become independent of all save God, and that they're the macrocosm of spiritual reality. Because in the hidden words, it says, the entire universe cannot contain me, the one true invisible God, but the heart of the true believer can contain me. This makes us the macrocosm. But we can't unite the religions. We can't unite the governments. We can't unite the companies. Now, governments and nation states should be in competition with each other because we have unity and diversity. Individuals should be competing with not just violently with each other, but to improve upon themselves, as well as having healthy competition with each other, like sports, art competition, who builds the better product, who grows the sweeter tomato. People like to do this. We like to have friendly competition. War is also competition, but it's violent and brutal, and it destroys cooperation and stuff. So we're not saying that we should get rid of the fiery spirit of human beings to compete with each other like in a foot race or in a spelling bee, or who can make the best computer, or in art or music or theater or cinema or literature, whatever else people are doing. These are the human pursuits of competition that need to be protected and preserved. And nations and states, they like to have, you know, mascots. They pick animals to represent their state or country. Football and sporting teams do the same thing. They pick a team name, they compete with each other, and then they have the World Cup, and everybody's interested and excited about this. They'll even riot during a World Cup. You know, one team wins, they'll overturn cars and set things on fire, and they'll wrestle with the fans and opposition. Well, fine, nobody's being killed, even if there's some minor property damage. We're not talking about making all of these things oppressive and illegal. We're just saying that if we all focus on the fact that we're each an individual person, and our right to life, just one of us, means that if somebody comes in with an army from another country and harms us, they violated our basic human right. Therefore, they broke the law. War is illegal. Now, as you can probably tell, we can talk about, go round and round about this for a long time, but nothing is going to change in this world. There's going to be no betterment for humanity in the least. None of the other problems are going to be resolved. We can't get the people together to cooperate on world climate, which they stated if we don't stop the war machine polluting by 2050, we won't be able to breathe, they're saying. That's how polluted the air is going to get. We need world cooperation and unity of thought and world health. We need to stop seeing people in the United States shot in the back of the head because they're African American or black or colored or not what the mainstream here is. We're seeing the repeat of what happened 2 years ago today. We're seeing another wave of the pandemic coming out, and we're seeing a black man in Michigan being shot in the back of the head, the United States, with a gun. whereas before it was the first wave of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. And then we saw, after the murder of George Floyd, a riot on the Temple Mount. And yes, this week, again, after the new wave of the pandemic, we've seen a man shot in the back of the head, and now we see a riot on the Temple Mount. So instead of it being spaced out, 6 months from each other, these things are happening like within the same week now, over and over and over again. How are we going to remove all these problems? The IMF has announced world cooperation is completely disintegrating because of all this. We have to come together and cooperate and agree on one thing. And it's not women's right to vote, because they have the right to vote now. It has to be something else. And the only thing that everybody on the planet agrees on, whether they're American, Russian, Ukrainian, Iranian, Israeli, North Korean, is they don't want war. There's no reason for North Korea to have all of those weapons, except it's afraid it's going to be invaded and overthrown. And the same with China, the same with Russia. Russia doesn't have enough money to invade the world. It just wants to do whatever Russians do inside the Russian border and not have their culture and their language and their morals and their values and their ethics overthrown. And it's tired of being accused of, not doing the right thing inside its own borders. Because when the United States points the fingers at Russia or China, Russia and China can point the finger back and be like, well, there's no school shootings here. We don't see people just going into a school of children and just shooting them all up. They have had terrorist problems that have taken over schools, now and then, but the amount of shootings and stuff in the United States and these other things are frightening for people who live in North Korea and in these other countries where they want some sort of social order. Why do they want social order in their country? It's the same thing. It's because each person in the country wants the right to life. No one wants to live in a country where there's social chaos and social disorder, and a group of people might rise up and come to their house and home invade them and rob them and kill them. They want some sort of modicum of security that people are going to be law-abiding. And this is a universal problem from our local place where we live right up internationally. All the people need to do if they want to cooperate is to get together and cooperate on this first thing, this primary thing, the thing that if we don't agree to, all the other problems are caused as the secondary result of this one root problem. This root problem is war, and war has to be made illegal. Well, why hasn't war been made illegal? It's because of what it says in the scriptures, that the love of money is the root of all evil. The only reason the soldiers in Russia are going into the Ukraine as individual people is that's how they get money. They're soldiers. They get paid to be soldiers. So when they're commanded to do something, that's their job. If they weren't getting paid any money, there was no volunteers in Russia being like, yes, let's raise up a volunteer militia and go in and save our brothers in the Donbass or whatever the problem is on some level. No, they're paid to do it. And in the last 50 days, the United States has spent, I might get this figure wrong, you can fact check it, something like $3 billion supplying or more Ukraine with weapons. And we've been training the Ukrainian soldiers in American-style fighting skills to use these weapons since the problems that began in the Donbass and Crimea in 2014. So again, Americans don't want to fight Russia directly, and NATO's arming the Ukrainian people that supposedly aren't part of NATO to punch Russia in the nose in this way. All right, well, good news. This whole scenario is prophesied of in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, 38, and 39. In 38, it says Gog and Magog, which are mentioned in the Quran, that scholars have related to the Russian people, will have hooks put in their jaws, and they'll be dragged against their will into a conflict. And this is what we've seen happen today. Mersheimer's explained that because of the NATO expansion, this provoked Russia as an existential threat, they said, because they don't want their culture and their society absorbed into Western materialism and other things, and they feel like they have the right to live their life the way they want to within their own borders. So by NATO expanding, this has created this response in this way. And in the prophecy of Ezekiel, it says Russia would have hooks put in its jaws. So this fits the scenario. See? Russia had hooks in its jaws, according to NATO expansion, the way Mersheimer describes this, and they were kind of provoked and dragged into the Ukraine kind of against their will. Then it says in this prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that there'll be this 7-year period in which this will take place. And we already announced the actual start of the calamity. Whether there'll be 7 more years from this year forward for this war, that could be possible too. But we've been counting the 7 years of purification from Nowruz of 2020 forward. So we're in year 3 at this point, with 4 more years of the spiritual purification. So there's the 7-year prophecy mentioned in Ezekiel 37, 38, and 39. And then it says that Gog and Magog, they'll have hooks in their mouth, they'll be pulled in, and it says they'll be defeated in the valley of Hamon-Gog, and that the people will see the dead and the destruction and the bodies of the people that were involved in this war in the valley of Hamon-Gog. And this valley of Hamon-Gog is the breadbasket valley of the Ukraine. Then it says there'll be so many bodies laying there, they won't know what to do with them all. And that's how chapter 38 and 39 ends. Well, chapter 37 of Ezekiel is the prophecy that starts with the valley of dry bones. And it talks about the resurrection of the dead. And then the second half of 37 says there's 2 rods, the rod of Ephraim, which means multitude of nations, and the rod of Judah, of David, which is the rod of wood. And these 2 rods will come together for an everlasting covenant of peace, is what it says in Ezekiel 37. Well, when people read this, you know, the vision of Ezekiel, that they read 37 first, the valley of dry bones, and the rod that will come together that will resurrect the dry bones. Then they read about the Gog and Magog having hooks in their jaw, Russia being pulled into the valley of Hamon-Gog, the breadbasket, Ukraine. And then in 39, it talks about all the dead and the destruction and the 7 years thing and these type of things, okay? Well, because of this, people can't understand the prophecy that the dry bones, which he describes first, are actually what happens when dead people are lay around longer. Their corpses disintegrate until all that's left are dry bones. So the slaughter mentioned in the valley of Hamon-Gog, which would be Ukraine, that Russia has put hooks in its mouth that's dragged into against, that's the fresh bodies that are described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So the vision of 37 actually comes after the slaughter of Gog and Magog in the valley of Ukraine, Hamon-Gog. It comes after this because of this problem in the Ukraine. This is the prophesied place that God has indicated, that Baha'u'llah himself has indicated when he was at the shore of the Black Sea, that will result in mankind coming together, resurrecting from the dead, and forming a world council, a supreme tribunal. That's foundational statement shall be, war is illegal. It's a violation of the basic human right to life. So this is the good news of Ezekiel chapters 38, 39, and 37, if you read them in that order, that we're at the point in world history where God, the Almighty Being, has indicated through the mouth of his prophets of the past that we can come together as human beings and actually have international cooperation. Now, this message about how to form the Supreme Tribunal and have this resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of the anti-war movement, the resurrection of the human rights movement globally, the resurrection of what it means to be a human being as a spiritual embodiment and a tabernacle of the universal spirit of God that is the macrocosm, and nation states are part of the microcosm and don't have the right to kill any member of the macrocosm, which is any person. That's what we're on the threshold of seeing. Now, whether or not this is going to play out the way that it's playing out, and then they're going to elect the Supreme Tribunal and make war illegal will be the reason they will elect that. Or we're going to go into 1 hour of thermonuclear war, which is also prophesied of because of what's happening in the Valley of Hamongog or the breadbasket of Ukraine. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say. But sooner, whether right now or after the nuclear war, all the survivors of this catastrophe will have to still come to the same universal conclusion that we can all agree upon, that if you're a human being, you have the right to life, and war is illegal for nation states. There's no way that we cannot get around this concept. Now, it's already a spiritual concept, and spiritual people already know that this is wrong. In the Ten Commandments, it says, thou shalt not kill. And these major wars that are taking place are murder on a vast scale. Jesus said to love thine enemy. So there's no reason for enemies to have an actual war between the nations. And there's no such thing as an enemy people. That's mentioned in the UN Charter. That should never have been put in there. And they should invoke God in the Charter. Of course, the spiritual people know this, endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights. No project gets started or completed without invoking God and being under the protection of God and the love of God. They forsook God when they built the Titanic, and the steel was brittle and it sank. And these things that people do where they separate themselves from God, like when they chose to build that shrine of Abdulbaha, contrary to the wishes of Abdulbaha, expressly stated in his will and testament and in his talks and discussions with people, this leads to grievous error that leads to grievous calamity. We're going to be grieving and grieving and grieving for 30 and 40 years after we survive 1 hour of thermonuclear war. It's a grievous error. That the war that's happening in the Ukraine now is our opportunity to seize the moment as individual people, citizens of the planet, being part of the macrocosm as a human being of humanity, and all of us, regardless of our race, creed, or color, our religion, or language, or culture, agree that war between the nations should be made illegal. It's no longer a viable settlement for human disputes between the nations. That's never happened before. That's where we're at right now. This next epoch, the second epoch of the golden age of Bahaullah that we're in now, has opened up with the actual physical fire at the shrine of Abdulbaha that was going to be built, symbolizing what he said in the 7 candles, that he himself would light the fire, that would then illuminate these candles the way he's lit the fire that's illuminated the Holy Spirit in the hearts of those who recognize his station as the center of the covenant. So this law case that you asked me about is about a violation of the Baha'i covenant that took place in 1957 and 1960 on top of Mount Carmel on the Baha'i shrines that also includes Akka and Baji. But the Baha'i World Center based on Mount Carmel, where Abdulbaha's house and the house Shoghi افندی lived in was on 10 Carmel Avenue in Haifa, Israel. And according to the biblical scholars, there's a mountain that's outside of the plain of Megiddo where this final battle would be fought. The same fight that's happening, that's World War I, World War II, and now this World War III skirmish. The war, World War I and II didn't solve the problem. And it's because the problem behind World War I isn't a shipping problem, like the War of 1812. The United States got into another war with England. They punched him in the nose, and British said, okay, we'll respect your shipping lanes. No more war. And since then, England and the United States have been buddies. They have 2 desks cut from the same wood from the same ship in the same war of 1812. One of those desks is in Buckingham Palace, the other one's in the White House. So the Revolutionary War solved the problem, they became independent. The War of 1812 solved the problem, they could have shipping, there's no more war. The purpose of war is it's the successful solution to the problem that caused the war to begin. That's why nation states forever have had the right to make war, because it worked. It solved the problem. America had a war of independence, now they're independent. Problem solved. The war worked. It was a good thing. It brought the problem solved. War of 1812, America can't do shipping. The British are attacking them. So they made war with England again, and they won. And ever since then, England and the United States have been friends. No more wars. Americans aren't like, we're in a revolution against England. We hate England. What would America be like now if all the propaganda in America was still anti-British? Well, Britain and the United States would be dire enemies, and the United States probably be friends with Russia and China against Britain. Who knows? You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend is the shibboleth these people go with. So if we've had a revolution, and in our revolution, we've pointed to the enemy that we said we wanted to be free from, and we know what those reasons were, and we had this war, and we won, and we're now independent. We don't need to still be in the revolutionary frame of mind, I hate my enemy, that caused the revolution in the first place, because that problem's been solved. The problems that caused World War I can't be solved by a war. That's why World War I didn't solve the problems that caused World War I. And because World War I didn't solve the underlying problems that were behind World War I, we had World War II. And World War II ended with the UN Charter being written that still names people to be the enemy and still doesn't declare war illegal. So we're starting in now to what's this World War III scenario out of Ham and Gog of the breadbasket of Ukraine. And the war isn't going to solve the problem. Because if war would solve the underlying problem, the war of World War I would have solved the problem then. We've been in a 100-year war with 3 battles, one called World War I, one called World War II, and now this. And the whole thing is described of as the Battle of Armageddon. It's a 100-year war. We're still in it. Well, why is it called Armageddon? Well, in Hebrew, Har, H-A-R, means mountain. It's the Battle of Armageddon because in Hebrew, that's Greek, it's the Battle of Har Megiddo. And Harmageddon, the mountain of the Valley of Megiddo, all Bible scholars realize who investigate this, is Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is the mountain of Megiddo. The covenant was broken on the top of Mount Carmel. When Abdulbaha told them he didn't want his body put in the shrine of the Bab because he didn't want to be in a holy shrine because there's only 2 manifestations of God, and he wanted to be buried next to his brother and his sister and his mother, they didn't listen to him, and they put his body in the shrine. These are the same people that were in his family when a month earlier he said, cablegram Shoghi Effendi and tell him to come back from London immediately because he knew he was dying. And they refused to do this. They sent Shoghi Effendi a snail mail letter. Why wouldn't they just do what the old man wanted? He knew it's his grandson. He wanted him home. They said, well, they were thinking of Nasut. Well, he won't finish his studies. He won't be able to catch up. He'll have to drop out of school. It'll interfere with his life in the world of Nasut. Well, this is Abdulbaha. So Abdulbaha said, very well. He went back into his room, and they sent him a snail mail letter. And then he got a cablegram saying Abdulbaha died, and he collapsed. And after that, he got the snail mail letter saying he should come back. And by the time he got there, they had put Abdulbaha's remains in the shrine of the Bab against Abdulbaha's own will. Not only that, the will and testament of Abdulbaha, the sacred covenant, was addressed to Shoghi Effendi. On the outside, on the 7th seal, it says to Shoghi Effendi, the chosen branch. And one of the daughters, one of his aunts, and so forth, they're like, write this. It's in The Priceless Pearl by Ria Khanum. And they state that because it's addressed to Shoghi Effendi, it's illegal. They're not allowed to open the document. Well, they opened it anyway. So the will and testament was violated right at the beginning when they opened it without Shoghi Effendi opening it. Now, the reason this happened is because if Shoghi Effendi would have opened the will and testament, this is sealed with 7 seals, they would see that he broke the seal, literally, and they would think he's the Lamb in the book of Revelation who breaks open the scroll written within the Kitab Yad, and on the back, the will and testament sealed with 7 seals. So by having somebody else violate this and open it, that we know that they're not the Lamb, and that the opening of the 7 seals in the book of Revelation is symbolic. Well, this 100 years from we're not going to cablegram Shoghi Effendi to come back and visit you, and we're going to put your body in the holy shrine of the manifestation, which you said you didn't want, and we're going to open your will and testament, even though you addressed it to somebody else. These 3 violations at the beginning of the 100 years of the covenant from 1921 to 2021 has now come to a conclusion with this fiery Holocaust at the proposed new shrine of Abdulbaha that they were building, outside of the Rizwan Garden in Akka, because they were going to move his body, his sacred remains, and desecrate them off of Mount Carmel. Well, Mount Carmel's the mountain of Megiddo. At the same time, friends, that all this is happening, we are being sued, and now I'm being sued personally, by this group of people on Mount Carmel, which in the tablet of the Holy Mariner, he says something like a burning fiery meteor will drive them off the mountain. Well, this conflagration at the supposed site of this shrine is something like a burning meteor. But if we don't see it like that, as something like a burning meteor, then it's not going to make the change. If we can't open our third eye and use insight and see that the prophecies of Ham and Gog in the valley of dry bones is being fulfilled now in Ezekiel chapter 37, 38, and 39, then how are we going to prevent and stop the rest of the prophecies in the book of Revelation for a third of mankind being killed in 1 hour of thermonuclear war from taking place? Now, in the book Nostradamus Prophecy, written by Victor Woods, we have a copy of the indictment. The indictment was issued indicting all humanity for refusing to make war illegal and for violating the everlasting covenants of God. It was issued by Dr. Leland Jensen on behalf of the 24 elders in the book of Revelation. In other words, the members of the Universal House of Justice in 1979 and 1980. The Universal House of Justice, the IBCUHJ, approved and ratified this document on Rizwan at the 40-year anniversary of 2020. And this is when all these things started happening. The pandemic, the lockdown, the economic collapse, and now this war. So this indictment was first issued in 1980 and went into effect then. And the executive branch of the Bahai Faith, the guardianship of the Bahai Faith, the Davidic kings, the president of the House of Justice, ratified it and approved it from the executive standpoint in 2003 on the day of the covenant. And it was hand delivered by a process server to Madeleine Albright, indicting all of the people of this war machine, declaring make war illegal. After she got a copy of this, she had a personal spiritual transformation. And she's one of the heroes in the cause of God at this point. She then went around telling people that they have to, if we're going to have peace on earth and a universal collective security agreement between the nations, not exclude God from the equation. She said that whatever we do, there's this ominous, invisible third presence in the room, which is God. So this shows us that this has had influence. And now that the IBCUHJ finally approved the indictment officially on Rizwan of 2020, we're seeing the actual calamities taking place in this world. And it's no coincidence that Madeleine Albright passed on in the last week, the same as during the time of the invasion of Ham and Gog. So if we have insight and we can see the burning meteor prophecy fulfilled, and we can see that the covenant of the will and testament has been abandoned totally, we can fix the situation by cooperating together. The same way the nations can fix the situation by following the guidance of Madeleine Albright and coming together to make war actually illegal between the nations. And these two things are inseparable. When Muhammad Ali broke the covenant, he was based in the Ottoman Empire, and he pushed that Ottoman government to such a point that they were going to murder and crucify Abdulbaha on top of Mount Carmel. And right when that was going to happen with the final committee, the Ottoman Empire collapsed in order to save Abdulbaha from being desecrated and murdered. And now they're going to move his body somewhere where he doesn't want it moved to. And he certainly doesn't want a third shrine built in the Holy Land. There's nothing in the divine plan that says this at all. There's only two manifestations of God, the Bab and Bahaullah. In the Will and Testament, he says all else are his servants and abide by his bidding, including Abdulbaha, whose wishes is to be buried next to his brother and his sister and his mother with Shoghi Effendi in the same plot. This is what their wishes are. Yet the two individual successors to Baha'u'llah's covenant, the greater branch Abdulbaha and the lesser branch who replaced Muhammad Ali, Shoghi Effendi, their bodies are not interred where they're supposed to be. And they will be, later when some of these other issues are smoothed out first. So they're suing us this entire time and trying to suppress the fact that we are the first International Baha'i Council / Universal House of Justice, that we are the UHJ members that Shoghi Effendi appointed in his lifetime with the same presidency, Abdulbaha's son Mason, his grandson, and today's great-grandson, which was reestablished as the second International Baha'i Council by the only Baha'is that remained firm in the covenant that were left who had the authority to form the International Council that was in its appointed stage, that Shoghi Effendi himself appointed. And this is in the world today. And this is in the world today for divine guidance. Divine guidance doesn't mean you have to do what we're telling you to do, because we're not telling anybody to do anything. We're just pointing out that in the Will and Testament, it says they were supposed to turn to Shoghi Effendi and then the Universal House of Justice, which he set up with full membership on January 9th of 1951. So it was there for 7 years, overlapping his ministry. When he passed on, he had divine infallible guidance. That International Baha'i Council should have had a meeting with Mason Ramey chairing it, Abdulbaha's son, and his niece-in-law, Ria Khanum. They were the last two members of the Holy Family, Mason and Ruia, and the other members. But this didn't happen, just like it's happened all the time in the Bahai Faith. A fight broke out in the Holy Family. It wasn't Mirza Yahya fighting Bahaullah, and it wasn't Muhammad Ali fighting against Abdulbaha, and it wasn't Shoghi Effendi's aunts and parents and family fighting against him. It was Shoghi Effendi's widow, fighting against Abdulbaha's son. And people have to turn to the holy document of the Kitab-i-Yad, or the Will and Testament, to get through the smoke of what this is about. Every revelation, every manifestation is given two things: their family and the book. There's no such thing as a book without the family. The book is for the family. The book is for the family who are the family that are spiritual, that need the book so they can remain connected with the rays of the Holy Spirit. And the book tells them how to function as a family and trust in God during crises and catastrophe. And the book guides them to purifying themselves spiritually. And the book gives them a criteria so that through their intellect, they can understand how we proceed from one another, generation to generation, without having war and disruption in the running of human affairs and things like this. Moses gave his book, the Torah, and his family, Aaron, his brother, and the high priests, and they were guarded by the army of the Davidic kings from the other nations. Muhammad gave his book, the Quran, and his family through his daughter Fatima, Ali, peace be upon the holy family of the Ahlul Bayt. The Bab and Jesus didn't have any children. They both gave their holy book, the New Testament and the Bayan, and their collateral descendants of their family. Jesus had the Desposony, and the Bab has the Afna. So Adam gave his book in stone and his family through Seth and Enoch. Abraham had his book of the Sefer Yetzirah of the Kabbalah, and his family, Isaac and Jacob in the 12 tribes. And so we see this is the pattern. Baha'u'llah gave his book, the Kitab Yad, in which he names his family and how it continues by those who remain loyal to Abdul-Baha and the branch is they come after him so they can form their true temple or council. So Isaiah 2 references this house of the Lord, and it says they will learn war no more. We are the ones who have preserved this message. Our role is not to make the whole world Bahais or Jews or Christians and Muslims. We do our own Baha'i work in the Baha'i world and our own personal work and our personal lives and get to enjoy living in the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven in our spiritual Baha'i international community, the covenant. In other words, the Baha'is under the provisions of the covenant. And all of these people are free, that we don't collect any funds or money from anybody. We give all this video information for free. We publish our books for free on the internet so people can get this message. But where the rubber hits the road is the gift that we have, and the mission of our next century of the covenant is to make war illegal. All of the Baha'is are focused on this when it comes to the pragmatic. What difference does it make to me as far as the way things work in the world of Nasut? The difference is without war, then the economies will change, the educational system will have, it will just cause everything to roll back. Also, if we state that war is illegal because it violates the basic human right of what it means to be a human being, well, that's already given the equality of men and women are both human beings. Black, white, yellow, green, red, purple, polka dot, and blue, they're all human beings. Jew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Zoroastrian, Buddhist, name the faith, they're still human beings. This concept of make war illegal establishes the core value of the oneness of humanity because it violates the essential human right of each macrocosmic human being, the right to life, which is something all human beings share in common. And our job, if we come together, if we're not making war illegal, what are we going to do with ourselves if we're not having war? Now we're going to have a lot of free time. Our job is to replenish the earth and to build up spiritual civilization. And there's plenty of other things to do, even competitive-wise, without an actual war between the nations. Well, do you hear what we're saying? Is we're the only ones saying this. The Sans Guardians aren't warning people of the prophecies of Ham and Gog and the thermonuclear war. They didn't issue the indictment 40 years ago. And the reason we did these things is to get the attention of the general public that war needs to be made illegal so the nations can elect the Supreme Tribunal, those two rods mentioned in Ezekiel 37, for an everlasting covenant of peace, for a durable peace. And we know how to elect the Supreme Tribunal. Abdulbaha sent a letter to The Hague for a durable peace about how to elect this. So we have the blueprint, we have the plan. We're not telling people what to do, we're just showing people what they can do if they choose to implement it. And this is what Abdulbaha says our role is in the treatise on the art of government, the Risaya, something Sais or something like that, that what he says is that religious leaders just give guidance. They're not allowed to interfere in politics or what the governments do or the wars that they're fighting between themselves because they have reasons for doing this. And they need those wars to solve their problems, like the Revolutionary War in the United States, the Iran Revolution, the French Revolution, the War of 1812. These wars work. The Iran-Iraq war is important to do that. Can't have Iraq come in and take over Iran, and Iraq can't have Iran come over and take over Iraq. Now, the fact that the U.S. was doing a proxy problem there is just another egregious, awful thing that we want to see finally eliminated. Wars used to work. You know, this war in the Ukraine is not working, and it's prophesied it won't work in the book of Ezekiel 37, 38, and 39, and it's prophesied that the people will wake up and they will elect the Supreme Tribunal for an everlasting covenant of a durable peace because they will make war illegal. So that's the good news about this. Bad things happen all the time, but they're not prophesied of. when a bad thing can be shown to be prophesied of, like the burning meteor, something like a burning meteor on Mount Carmel, and this Ukraine Hamongog thing, that means if it's fulfilling prophecy, that God has a prophesied solution. All we can do is prevent that prophesied solution to the people of the world, like a meal fit for a king. And they can pick what they want to choose from that, like the tablet of all food and the banquet table outspread supper of the Surah of the Quran and the marriage supper of the Lamb prophecy in the book of Revelation of the outspread banquet. They're free, like in a smorgasbord, to pick and choose what they need that will work for their diet, the nutrition they need, and how to implement the solution for their people and their country and their relations with the other nations to make war illegal, because we have to uphold basic human right to life if you're a human being. And because we're the caretakers of the planet, we will take care of, as the Native Americans say, the rock people, the ant people, the bird people, the star people, everything's alive. He says in the tablet of Auguste Farrell, everything's in motion. And it's the God consciousness of the force of love through all things that's causing this to happen. And now we're at the cusp of seeing this realized at the level of humanity. So we're the only ones that are able to explain this. We're the only ones that have the Baha'i message of how to elect the Supreme Tribunal. We're the only sober people that understand the focal point of this is to make war illegal, and that doing so will establish the oneness of humanity across the board in the hearts, minds, and souls of all the people, because everybody's a human being. And once that's in place, all the other problems, because people will be cooperating, now that war isn't disrupting our cooperation, we can clean up the environment, we can go green, we can get rid of fossil fuels, and the rich people who are making money off of the war, they can remain rich and wealthy by changing their business activity models to producing some other good product or service that keeps them, as rich and as wealthy or as independently wealthy as they may wish to be without the war machine. Now, nations will still have enough weapons and armies to defend their own borders. So it's not like we're going to demilitarize the world. That's not what I'm saying. That the nations will still have police and an FBI or a Bureau of Investigation. There'll still be an Interpol, and there'll be a collective security agreement between the nations.